Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Elevating the Status of Teaching panel tonight. This panel is being live streamed, and so what you say or do will be shown on the internet. And I believe if you think someone might benefit from this conversation or enjoy seeing it, I believe it will be archived on the Bowdoin website probably tomorrow. So my name is Doris Santoro, and I am a professor in the education department at Bowdoin College. And thank you all for being here today. And I want to, before I introduce our panel, I would just like to say a few words about why we're having this conversation and what's making this conversation possible today. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Brody family for their continued support of teaching. Their support, both financial and ideological and moral, helps us to elevate the status of teaching at Bowdoin and encourages space for these conversations. Thank you also to Sarah Chingos, our program placement and outreach coordinator at Bowdoin. She has made all of this possible today. So the fact that all of these people are here is due to Sarah, so thank you, Sarah. Sarah certainly deserves many rounds of applause, so I'm glad that we paused for that. So our focus is on elevating the status of teaching today, but I want to make sure we understand that the status of teaching has always been dynamic. In the earliest schools in the US, teaching was part-time work, usually taken on by men during the agricultural off-season. As women gained entry into the profession, opportunities for women's public life increased dramatically, and teaching was a desirable profession for educated women and for families seeking upward mobility. In the Black community, teaching, along with preaching, was a revered profession that could ensure middle-class status. And while civil rights expanded opportunities across the board for all kinds of people, please come on in, don't worry about anything, just come. So while civil rights expanded opportunities for all kinds of people, there were unintended consequences for the status of teaching. Following Brown versus Board of Ed in 1954, over 39,000 Black teachers and principals lost their jobs to white teachers. Likewise, as women and people of color have gained expanded entry into the workforce, teaching, once viewed as a high-status occupation, has become low status. Globally, we have seen examples, such as Finland, that's elevated the status of teaching through requiring a 5th year of study that is paid for at the country's expense. But then we've also seen Japan, where teachers were once revered. Teachers are now reporting that they are experiencing diminished respect from their students and families. So status is dynamic. It is not static, and it is based on demographics and professional conditions. I think it's also important to note, even very close to home, Nancy Atwell, who just won the Nobel Prize for teaching, who teaches in Edgecombe, said that she would not recommend the profession of teaching to people today, given the conditions that teachers are under. She said that, okay, if you could find an independent school, great, but given what teachers are facing, she would not recommend the profession today. Likewise, to bring it even closer to home, at Bowdoin, I advise numerous students who look at me and say, but I'm at Bowdoin, why would I become a teacher? Or, my parents will kill me if I came to Bowdoin, and now I become a teacher. So that's some of what we'll be talking about tonight. So I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you very briefly about the Bowdoin Teacher Scholars Program. Here at Bowdoin, students complete a major in a subject area. We require that students have 2 courses beyond what the state requires in order to be eligible for certification. Students complete their minor in teaching while what they're doing is immediately getting involved in clinical practice, which means they're in schools, from their earliest education courses. Students can then apply for the Bowdoin Teacher Scholars Program if they complete a teaching minor. We require a 3.0 GPA, full-time placement in a local school for 14 weeks, development of a professional portfolio, and a defense of teaching principles and practices, as well as passing relevant praxis exams. While some students complete this program as undergraduates, many return as postgraduates and are supported generously by Bowdoin College, which provides free tuition, and the Snow family, and that fund provides stipends to defray living expenses for students during their internship. Among our Bowdoin Teacher Scholars are a Rhodes Scholar and several Fulbright Fellows, both past and future, some of whom are sitting in this room. Many Bowdoin Teacher Scholars live and work in Maine. And so many are here today. So if you are a graduate of Bowdoin's teaching certification program, or if you are about to be a graduate, would you please stand and be recognized, please? And I'd love to see a show of hands. I think there are many teachers in the audience tonight. Would you please raise your hand if you are a teacher and here tonight? Thank you. So the teachers here tonight know the intellectual, ethical, emotional, and political demands facing teachers today. They know that this work is rewarding, challenging, stimulating, and frustrating. And so my question is, and the question we'll think about on the panel tonight, is how can the status of teaching be elevated to meet the demands and rewards of teaching today? And so to help us think through this question, let me introduce our panelists. So we have Maria Libby, who is superintendent of MSAD 28 and the 5-town CSD, which includes Camden, Appleton, Hope, Lincolnville, and Rockport. And she is a Bowdoin alum and a parent of Eben Kopp. So, some people know Eben. Next is Meredith Nadeau, and she is also a Bowdoin alum, and she is superintendent of Cape Elizabeth Schools. So welcome. Next is Paul Hambleton. He is Deputy Executive Director of the Maine Education Association. That's the teachers union in Maine. Next is Jen Lunt, and she is a teacher at Portland High School. And finally, we have Betsy Webb, Superintendent of Bangor Public Schools. So for my first question, I'm just going to ask you to go down the line, and we'll start with Betsy. And the question is, have you ever been a teacher? If so, where and for how long?
Yes, I was a teacher, and my first stint was at Job Corps in Bangor. I worked with alternative education students for 3 years. I then was hired in Wells-Ogunquit. I was a computer programming teacher. I then went to Thornton Academy for 9 years and was the director of educational technology.
Thank you.
Is this on? Okay. So I've spent most of my teaching career in Portland Public Schools, but I started as a 7th and 8th grade teacher in Topsom, and I was a social studies teacher, and then I moved to be a 8th grade teacher at Lyman Moore Middle School in Portland. I then was one of the many teachers that thinks about maybe stepping out of the profession, and I was kind of looped back in by becoming part of Casco Bay High School and the startup of that high school. And then I've moved into, and I was a humanities teacher, and then I got so excited about teaching English language learners that I moved into teaching that in that capacity, and I've been at Deering High School and Portland. So I've been around Portland a lot.
I'm Paul Hambleton. I have a kind of a looping career. I started teaching in the community college system, taught business communications to students who were pursuing technology degrees, and this is in Wisconsin. Did that for 3 years, and then I went and became an elementary teacher for students with emotional disturbance. So went all the way to the other end. Then I became a middle school language arts teacher and did that for 8 years. And then I finished my career as a teacher and a public school teacher in high school teaching at-risk students, and it was English language arts as well as a broad range college prep students, that kind of thing. And the last several years, although I'm not in the classroom, I spend all of my time working with teachers in my capacity as an organizer, as an advocate, and as an expert in professional issues surrounding teaching.
I think we had similar pathways, actually. I started my career actually working in a group home with children with emotional and behavioral challenges and transitioned into becoming a middle school language arts teacher. I did that for about 5 years, working primarily with 8th graders, 7th and 8th graders, and then earned a degree in special education and moved into becoming a special education teacher, working with students with emotional and behavioral challenges. And yeah, that was about 5 years as well.
I'm Marie Libby. I like to think my first teaching job was with the Hurricane Island Outward Bound School as an Outward Bound instructor. It gave me a good foundation for what I later did. I also worked at 2 different boarding schools for 4 years, one in Colorado Rocky Mountain School, for a year as a science and math teacher at the high school level, and then 3 years at Proctor Academy in New Hampshire, also teaching science and math. Then I came to Camden, where I have been for 17 years, and started teaching in the middle school there for 6 years, math and science, and then have just moved up within that district.
Thank you. So it sounds from this group like no one can say that you are not acquainted with the rewards and challenges of teaching. So what I'd like to ask you to think about now, and we can take these responses in no particular order whenever it comes to you. So what 3 words or phrases come to mind when I ask you to characterize the best teaching you've witnessed?
Exciting, meaningful, and collaborative.
I would add engaged to that.
I would add passionate and reflective.
And I would add connecting with students.
All of that. And then I think rooted in relationship.
So here's really the center of our question. Having set the stage of that's the kind of teaching we want to see happening, that's the kind of teaching we want to be engaged in, how can the status of teaching be elevated to meet the demands and the rewards of teaching? Because it seems to me, hearing what that best teaching looks like, we would want the absolute best students to be going into the profession. So how do we counter the sense that we would want to say, oh, but that's just teaching? What do we do to counter that?
I think there's a backdrop in our country that needs to change in order for people to feel that teaching is an honorable and valuable thing to do. I think a lot of people in the profession absolutely feel that way, but people making a choice about their careers might not feel that way. And I think part of it is because of what happens in this country, particularly recently, where there has schooling and education and educators have been mostly under attack in the media. And I don't think that does anything to help elevate the status of teaching. And if nobody mentions some of the other ideas I have, I'll come back.
So I'd like to give you a fact that is pretty well researched. I can't cite the research, but if you take out the socioeconomic factors that teachers in the United States face, and you remove that and compare us to other countries in education, we're the best in the world. U.S. schools are doing a fantastic job when you take out the socioeconomic factors. We take everybody in our schools. Our public schools welcome every single student who walks through the door. That is not true across the developed world, but it's true in our country. It's true the way we teach. So I just want to lay that out there, that we're already doing a really good job. When you look through the noise, when you look through the politics of it, schools are doing wonderful work across our country. I think the answer to elevating the profession really belongs with us, with teachers. What we need are people who are leaders. Teachers need to understand that they're leaders. They're experts in teaching. Don't let anyone take that away from you. And there's been a push to do that, to take away teacher expertise in assessing students. How do we assess students nowadays? We let Pearson do it. We need to do it. We need to assess students. We don't offload that kind of a thing. And it's too important to allow money to pollute the system. That's going to take teachers to stand up, use their voices, and say, we are the experts. Because, you know, people believe in their own teachers. They really do.
I'll go next. I think it's really interesting because right away we went to the external and we went to the internal. The sort of what's happening outside of us that's keeping us here, and what's happening inside that is not pushing us, you know, out to show this other level of status. And I think it's both. I think that both of those things, you know, you hope that society will change and that there will somehow be this wave that comes back from whatever we've been in. But from what I know of the history of education, there's always this intensity of, well, teachers have to be doing this and this has to change, and this criticism of public education. And I think one of the things that is important for us to think about is, you know, what do we hope the status of teacher could be? Because I put this out to Facebook before I came to this thing tonight, because I was like, oh my God, how do you answer this question? And one of the people who wrote back was saying that, you know, the status is so confused. It's such an odd profession when you think about it. You know, we're state certified, but we're not state employees. We're public servants, but we're not really public servants. We've signed yearly contracts, but we're just going, you know, I mean, it's a strange dynamic when you think about what the profession is. And I think clarifying that, and it comes from both sides, the external and internal, would be to say, okay, where do we want the status of teaching to be? And what I was thinking about today is, you know, thinking back historically or thinking about what we might need as our society now is thinking, what if teaching was seen as, you know, one of those core central parts of communities, and that how family-centered schools could be. A lot of teachers are parents, and yet we don't have daycare centers in our schools or childcare in our schools where we can go and connect with our students with our kids. The kids, we have to figure out some strange childcare out there and figure it all out. And that's one thing. I mean, those are like small things, structural things that we could do in our schools. Change the dynamic of teacher conferences so that parents are really welcome. Bring the status, you know, we can't always control money or those kinds of things, but maybe we control the structures where teachers are in their communities. Bring back sort of that heart of having them be a center.
Another thought is we need to do a better job sharing what a wonderful profession it is. I come from a lifelong line of educators, and I never had a moment that I didn't believe I was going to be an educator. I can't imagine doing anything other than being an educator. My husband laughs at me because I still say I'm going to school. I refuse to say I'm going to work. And I just think we have to have the brightest and the best understand that this is a calling, that you are educating the next generation. If you want to make a difference, there's no better place to be. And I think we have to honor that this is one of the most complicated professions there are. You know, there's research that suggests that you don't even hit your peak or your stride until your 15th year of teaching. There's not a day that I go to school that I don't learn more about children and how their brains work and what they need from us. And I agree that we need to be the voice collectively about what a wonderful profession it is. We cannot allow students not to achieve, to let them slip through the cracks, to have a barrier like a second language. No more excuses. No more saying that it's just, I taught the material, they didn't get it, that was their fault. Remembering that every parent loves their child and they're looking to you to help. And I know that's what keeps me motivated. And I just think that there needs to be greater resources to help people meet that calling. You look at residency for doctors. Why don't we do residency for teachers? Because if it takes 15 years to hit your stride, why not find a way to give people new to the profession more supports so that they can continually collaborate, all those wonderful words that we were using, exciting, collaborating, engaged.
Passionate, reflecting, connecting with others.
I would just echo that I think one thing that could help to elevate the status is to actually heighten the entry requirements to become a teacher, which is obviously what they did in Finland. The top 10% of graduating high school students are the ones who are admitted to teacher education programs. And I just don't think that has been our country's story. In fact, a lot of the data would show the opposite of that. It's why one of the reasons why I'm excited to be at a place like Bowdoin, because obviously a Bowdoin alum, it frames my thinking, but I constantly think we need more Bowdoin students to go into teaching in the state of Maine. And some of that, I've hired Bowdoin graduates and am truly amazed at how quickly they're able to understand pretty complex things that we're trying to do. And I think that the critical reasoning ability that a liberal arts education brings you is really required because it is a very difficult job and it's complicated. And I think, in countries such as Finland, where it is more difficult to become a teacher, their salaries are actually comparable to teacher salaries here, but the difference is that other professions aren't paid so much more than teaching. So teaching is more in line with some of the other professions. I certainly think it would help in this country if there was somehow a reallocation of resources so that teachers were paid more. I also often reflect on the differences in my experience working at 2 different boarding schools and then having been in public education for a long time. The resources that I was afforded at an independent school were far greater than they are in a public system. And the demands on me as a teacher were far less, in so much that I had time to really develop relationships with students, prepare for my classes, and not live a life of total stress. And I do think that in many systems in America today, teachers are just being strapped and pressured from every direction. There are external mandates coming nonstop. And I often walk around thinking one of the things we need to do is make this job more doable and more humane for the people in the system. And sometimes I think that could be by increasing the teaching force by about 50% so that we're not asking people to do so much work, because it is very difficult.
I want to jump right off of that. My sister, who may be watching and who is a teacher in Bloomfield, New Jersey, told me that she needs a secretary. And so I was curious what you think needs to be done to combat what has been documented in the education research as the intensification of teaching, right? And so it's not that the work of a teacher interacting with a student that may not look all that different than it did 40 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, but all of the other work that has been added on into the work of teaching has has created a sense of intensification. So I wonder if you might talk about how you see intensification happening and what you think teachers need in order to get a little more space. So I like Maria's answer of we need to increase we need to double the teaching force, but what other ideas do you have?
So we had a recent conversation in my district about a concern about communication, parent feeling that the team wasn't providing adequate communication. And when we looked at emails over the course of this year, there had been some 300 emails back and forth. And so I think about that, and I think that's at least 2 a day, 3 a day in many cases. That's a lot of communication. And so I think we have a responsibility to kind of reset those expectations. Just because communication is available all the time doesn't mean that a teacher has to respond to 25 if they're lucky in an elementary classroom, or 100 emails if they're teaching at the secondary level in the course of a day or a week or a month. They need to share how they're going to communicate. That's important. Parents need to know how to access teachers, but put the brakes on, set a boundary, and get some support. As an administrator, I think it's my job to sort of help set what are realistic expectations around that.
I think teaching is a team sport. It's hard to do it in isolation, and people have tried, and many have succeeded, but it really is a team sport, and that we've talked about collaboration. It's something that the best schools aren't made of one great teacher. They're made of a group of teachers that connect with each other, have time to plan together, and that's the critical part. Have time to plan together and talk about their students, their subjects, and that ends up being kind of the last thing that happens sometimes in a lot of schools. And this gets to the time equation and how we use time in schools better. And I think that also relates to status, because teachers who work closely with other teachers, where they're working together, developing ideas together, this is what gives a teacher a far more sense of belonging and being part of a community, and then being able to focus on the challenges of working with kids. And I would say that's even more important now than it was before, partly because of the things you're talking about. The things move a lot faster. So nowadays, and probably most of you can do it, if somebody has a question about when Abe Lincoln was born, you can Google it. It's right there. All the world's information is right at your hands. If I'm a teacher and I need a lesson for something, I can tweet something out and say, oh, I'm interested in teaching about this today, and if I use the right hashtag, I can get 10 very specific responses. So information is so available and so at your fingertips, but it really is that time to plan, work with other teachers, and focus what you're doing on the students that are in your school.
I think these are really, really great points, because I'm thinking about, in terms of administration, and what I hope sometimes is that so many teachers by nature are people who want to know the whole story behind something. So they'll engage in a long conversation or sit with someone who's in the middle of a learning moment, because you want to be part of that. And to be able to do that, you can't do that all the time, and you can't do it so much that you step away from all of the things that you really need to do. And my husband's a teacher as well, and one of the things we've been talking about, he was in a role in a self-contained classroom for years and really did not have planning time. And when this year he's moved into a totally different role in school, and he has planning time. And he's sort of at a loss for how to use it, effectively, and he's looking for models. He's looking around his building to try to figure those things out. And I think one of the things that we need administrators and teacher team leadership connected, structures in our buildings to help us understand those things. Because if left to our own devices, sometimes we will just continue to take on, because oftentimes that's the type of people we end up being. And I think one of the other things that was raised for me is that I feel like there are a lot of conversations that I walk into with other teachers where there's a lot of fear of youth. Not that they are part of our classroom and that we're just in this relationship with them, but that that we need to figure out how to deal with all of this stuff, their iPhones and their iPads and all their, and it's like, to me, that I think we have to start embracing that in a way that we really haven't as a profession, and start to understand how much of a collaborative tool that can be. And I think when we talk about how faculties can deal with that, looking for ways to innovate teacher leadership so that people who have a handle on that, on how to do that new stuff, are being given opportunities to share that. And I think too often we might be in a constricted space where there have been layoffs and there have been this and there's all this stuff coming outside. And when people are like this, they aren't innovators. Innovators look like this. And so whatever administrators can do to take those things off our plate, take the fear away so that we can innovate, that's when we'll get some of the really great work that'll move things forward.
I'm going to take off from your answer because I think my role as an administrator and a leader is to figure out how to buffer the federal legislation that's coming down into the local as well as the state. And I struggle and often advocate with our congressional delegation as well as our state legislature that one size doesn't fit all. And to treat a very rural state like Maine in a broad brush like you would very urban metropolitan areas does not make sense. And I think the intensification is often unfunded mandates with paperwork that doesn't make any sense. And it's really frustrating for teachers, and I know for me, and I'm sure the other administrators would say this, we spend an exorbitant amount of time trying to squint at legislation that we have to meet, but not lose the success that we have as our own school system. A good example would be response to intervention. It's a great idea. Bangor's been doing it for decades. It's called student improvement plans. And so it's just so frustrating to take something that has worked for us for so long to then now have to meet something that we are required to do, and it's less efficient and less effective. And so if I had my one wish, it would be, if you're having success, let that school organization continue to build upon that success. If you are not meeting expectations, that's when you come in and say you need to do it differently.
Betsy, can I ask you for an example of a way you've been able to try to protect or buffer your teachers from some paperwork or communication that you felt did not improve their practice or their teaching?
Well, certainly response to intervention, we streamlined with a system that we had decades of success with. That would be one example. Another example that isn't always popular, but we have basically a 6-hour day. We have to use every minute. We have more than 50% of our students on free and reduced lunch status, and yet we compete with Cape Elizabeth. So what we do is we are very purposeful about our time, and we don't allow other organizations' mission to become our mission. And it's hard because I have more than 25 requests weekly for people to come in and use our time to meet their expectations or their mission. And they're all wonderful, wonderful organizations with great missions. But if we don't protect our academic time, then we're not going to have success. And what the teachers tell me is that they really appreciate that, because they don't, their time is interrupted every single time there's an assembly, or there's a new program, or there's something. And so really trying to listen to them, that they need that academic time with their students.
Meredith, it looked like you had something to say in response to that.
Well, not necessarily strictly in response to that, but I was thinking just about that element of protecting time, and I think that we are equally guilty sometimes, to Betsy's point, that we think something's the greatest thing that's come along, and so we want to figure out how we can incorporate that into our schools and stray from what's the most valuable part of the day, which is that instructional time with teachers. It doesn't matter whether you have 60% poverty or whether you have 7% poverty like we do in Cape Elizabeth, but you have to hold on to that instructional time and put teachers in charge of how that time is used. As a principal, we had a building team that made a decision that there would be no interruptions to the schedule before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. If we had to do anything, it would have to happen between 1 and 3 as a school community, and we tried to really minimize that to once a month so that we could hold on to that time, which allowed teachers, I'm looking at Dominique, one of the Bowdoin scholars, but that allowed teachers to really maintain the creativity and the choice and control in their classroom. And I think that's another way you elevate the status of teaching, is to really maintain that flexibility and allow teachers to teach in ways that are exciting for them, that invite their passion, not to give them, to the extent that we can avoid it. Here's the plan. By Friday, you need to be on, chapter 12. Pacing guides, I think, get in the way of teaching. Overly structured curricula get in the way of teaching. Having set standards, having clear expectations for outcomes, that's important. All of us can deliver lessons that help to meet those standards, but I think that's another way we help teachers.
Go ahead, Paul.
I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I think one of the things that has created this sense of intensity is the overuse of standardized testing and the misuse of standardized testing. I think teachers invented tests, so tests themselves are not the problem. But if accountability means a student's score on a standardized test, that becomes very problematic. It gets to the issue you're talking about. It gets to, now, what am I supposed to be teaching? If I've got to have that child do better on a very specific test, that creates a whole different dynamic than, as a teacher, I'm responsible for that child's learning. I do the assessment, I do the teaching, and I help move that child along. That's a very different thing than teaching to a test. So, we just have to be honest. I have to be honest that I believe, is what has created an awful lot of accountability suddenly equals test score. Instead of accountability means I'm helping a student learn and I'm responsible for that student's learning. Those two are not the same thing. I can live with that one. What I think a lot of teachers have trouble with is accountability to move a test score.
I want to go back to something that Jen said, Jen had a vision of offered a vision of the status of teaching as teacher as core of the community. And when we created the title for this panel, Elevating the Status of Teaching, you can elevate to wherever, right? So what is the vision of the status of teacher that you'd like to see? And what would it take for us to get there?
One of the things, when I started teaching, I was the new teacher on a team, and there was another teacher on my team had been teaching for 30 years, and it was a small community, and she and I went to the grocery store in the middle of the day to go get something for a class party. And if you've ever had the chance to walk through a grocery store in a small community with a teacher who's been teaching 30 years, it's incredible. And it's almost like she needed to go incognito. Every single person knew her in some capacity. It was incredible. And you want to talk about status. She was, that's her. Oh my gosh. Grown men coming up to her saying, oh my, just giddy because they had such a warm feeling about her in their heart. And I think, it was really inspiring as a new teacher to see that and to think, well, what does that take? And I think one of the things that I think about is that communities are sort of nebulous in today's society, and in every state and region they're a little bit different. But if you have those places where we do meet up in person, not necessarily online, but actually in person, teachers can be this connective tissue to the organism. And I think one of the ways that we do that is recognizing the humanness of teachers. She was a human going to the grocery store, interacting with other humans. That's where she was. She wasn't standing up in front of, a group of people with tons of authority. She was herself, and she was not afraid to be part of the community. And I think sometimes I have felt sort of strange if I step out of the boundary, if I have had students to my home, if I have done any of those things where you're like, well, you're supposed to keep that boundary and you don't want to get too close to that family, or you don't want to. And right now, I just recently, I have a student who's just moved to the country, and I went to her home to see it. They had just gotten out of the family shelter, and she was thrilled. They had been in the family shelter for 3 months. And I went in, and there was one airbed in one bedroom and one airbed on another, and some pots that a church had given them. And that was it. And my mission is now to get furniture for this family. And I feel like that is a really important part of who I am to this student, but also to the greater community of people that she's connected to. And I don't mind crossing that boundary sometimes, because I feel like it does elevate the status. It elevates who we are to the people that we serve.
I'd like to just spice it up a little bit and add a counterpoint to that perspective. Because, I said before, and I really believe this, that the people in education, people who are teaching, administrators, highly value, and parents, highly value the teachers that their kids have. And people working in the system understand how difficult it is, how rewarding it is, how honorable it is, how we're all working for the common good of this country, basically. But I think in our country that community, family, isn't valued in a way that externally values things in our country. Because if you look at maternity and paternity policies, in childhood poverty rates, our country does abysmally with a lot of things revolving around family, community. They're just not things externally. When I think about what are the, professions that are elevated in our country, are doctors, lawyers, and why is it an elevated status to become a doctor? Everybody knows how hard it is to get into med school. Lawyers. Everybody knows how rigorous it is to study for the LSAT and get into law school, pass the bar exam. And I think that in this country, those are the type of things that equate to some elevated professional status from an external perspective. So I guess it kind of depends on how you're looking. If people haven't seen this, I would suggest that everybody go home and Google it and watch it on YouTube tonight. Not only because a Bowdoin alumni created it, but it is fantastic. And it's a YouTube video that Taylor Molly did on making a difference and teaching, and it is phenomenal. I show it at the beginning of the year to our staff. So there are a lot of people in the system who understand, who highly value the profession. I think part of it is elevating the status in the ways that externally are recognized in our country. And I think that it would require some other types of mechanisms than focus on becoming an integral part of the community, which I think is part of the mission anyways.
I think that I mentioned earlier that becoming a leader, teachers are leaders. They're leaders in their classroom. And one of the things, if you put teachers in front of other adults, they'll sometimes think, well, I don't know how to talk in front of people. But they've been spending their days speaking to maybe small people. Teachers need to recognize that they are leaders. They are connectors. They're organizers in their own right. And one of the things that we're trying to do at Maine Education Association is equate some of those skills. Maybe it's time for teachers to talk to policymakers and make them listen to us. They don't always want to, but teachers are the people in the classroom that actually understand what the implications of these big decisions are. So Maine has the proficiency-based diploma. It's a great idea. There are some really interesting facets to that. There's some Kool-Aid to drink with it, and it's very exciting. But when you get down to the level of how does that look when you implement it in a school system, it turns out to be very complicated. It takes a lot of time. Requires people to learn a lot of new things. And one of the things that teachers need to do, I believe, and that we're working for that to happen, is to start connecting with policymakers to say, this is what it's like from the ground level. You're maybe up there at 30,000 feet, and if you know what you're talking about, that can be interesting. If you don't, it's dangerous. But you need to get the voice of teachers who are actually implementing these policies, whether it be proficiency-based diploma, it could be a new set of standards. The one that we're dealing with right now are called Common Core standards. We've got next generation science standards coming up. That kind of thing is going to work best, I believe, when teachers are involved in actually figuring out how to implement this and how to tweak it or change it, or maybe even throw it out and do something better. Because education's not a product. It's a process, and it will always be a process. It's not like we're going to get to a spot and say, oh my God, here it is, we did it. We're done, we can quit changing. That's not what's going to happen. The world is continuing to change, and we need to develop a process, and I believe teachers need to be involved with that process very integrally. So teacher leadership can be right in your classroom. You don't need to go, and with all due respect to administrators, they're leaders too, but teachers can be leaders in their own right, in their own classroom. There are many, many teachers that don't want to go on and do something else. They just want to be great at being a teacher. They want to share their skills with other teachers, with new teachers coming in. We really need to take a hard look at how we develop those sort of career ladders for new teachers, mid-career teachers, and veteran teachers to collaborate and help each other in this ever-changing, complicated world. Talk to policymakers, talk to parents, work in your community. There are so many opportunities for leadership for teachers. So that's my vision of how we make this work.
I think there's a piece of it bringing more people into our schools also. I think, while we have a lot of parents who come in at the elementary level because, the children are small and maybe seem less daunting, not as many parents and business leaders come into our middle and high schools. And I think for people to come in and spend a day shadowing a teacher or part of a day shadowing a teacher, seeing what the day-to-day is like, I think that's a way that you help people see what this profession is really about. That they can actually then go home and say, gosh, I actually get a break during my day. This teacher hasn't been able to go to the bathroom for 5 hours. I think the everyday person has no perspective on what the pace of the day is like and how many decisions a teacher is making on the fly, instructionally. Oh yes, we'll send a note home to your mom about that resource that you need for tomorrow. And yes, I know that you're getting picked up by grandma today, and I know your sister is sick, and that's really been worrying you a lot. I mean, there's so many in relational pieces that are on the mind of teachers, in addition to all of the instructional tasks and the worries about things like standardized testing that, no matter how much we maybe in local districts are trying to say, it's okay, it's not that big a deal, get over it. They don't know what they're doing, don't worry about it. I think teachers can't quite let go of that because we want to please people, we want to do well, we want things to be great, and we want to show our best face, and yet the most important thing is what's happening in that classroom in any given moment. And if we can help more people see what that is like, I think then the vision of teachers does improve as well.
Go right ahead.
I think going back to just that idea of well, how do we make sure that we really are being seen that with that stress and as the heart of the community? I'm concerned that we don't have enough of that, because just like you were saying about, well, let's do some comparison on family leave and let's go do some comparison on child poverty rates. My concern is that, when you think about how many teachers are out there and how many of us are doing such similar work, the fact that we still don't have, we aren't taking the lead, maybe whether it's our unions, our unions not doing enough to fight for these things, or ourselves not raising that awareness enough. The fact that there's so many young people who are then trying to manage family and teaching. and how many people at some point are going to say, wait a second, can I really make this work on this salary? Or wait a second, if I go back to full-time teaching and my baby's 8 weeks old, I'll put my child in daycare so I can go be with 25 to 100 other children during that day. That choice is incredibly difficult for anyone, but a parent who is a teacher, I think it's particularly difficult. And the fact that we continue to have teachers of all, everybody deserves good family leave on all of those different things. But I think our profession could take a leadership role in saying, wait a second, what's best for all kids, including my kids, and for me as a functioning human being, and being tuned into burnout and all of the intensification that we're that we're talking about. And I think maybe our profession is maybe that weird status gives us a different place in the dialogue. I don't know.
So that a sense of elevating the status of teachers is also about elevating the status of children, is your point.
Okay, here will be my, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Betsy, please.
Well, since you were looking at me and I thought I had
Okay,
to come up with
good.
something else.
My students feel that way too.
Okay, good. I think as a profession, we also have to have confidence during times of change, and that it's okay to try things differently, and that many, whether business people or politicians or parents, feel that we haven't changed enough, and we better be ready with our message, because as soon as we do try something differently, people revert to their own experience in education and want to tell us that that wasn't the way I did it in 7th grade or 8th grade. Mm-hmm. So I think having the courage to know what works, to understand that you hold on to tradition if it's tried and true, but that we need to start thinking about things differently as well. When information is at your fingertips, why do we make students memorize? So, and I really see it's courage and confidence is a big issue. So.
Well, that leads me very nicely into my final question, which is, what responsibilities do Bowdoin students have? Do current teachers have? Do Bowdoin professors and current other professors of education have for elevating the status of teaching? You can pick any one of those. You don't need to answer all.
So I was one of those students whose parents said, you went to Bowdoin and you're going to teach. And that was difficult. That was a difficult conversation with my dad. And I don't regret that choice at all. And I think he came around to realizing that, oh, actually, maybe that worked out okay for you. But that sort of was a crisis of, but this is what I'm really good at. This is what I believe in. This is what matters to me. And so being willing to say, this matters to me, our children matter to me, our teachers matter to us as taxpayers, as citizens, as scholars, that, I think, is the greatest service we can pay.
Well, I work for the union. In Maine, it's called the Maine Education Association. In 50 other states, there is an affiliate of either the National Education Association or the American Federation of Teachers. I would say this if I worked for it or not, but I think the most important thing you can do as a new teacher is join your association. That is where you find your colleagues, that's where you find your resources, that's where you find leadership opportunities. Unions are changing. They're not what they were. You get a bad rap if you're a union nowadays. The last 10 years have been kind of rough on unions. I come from Wisconsin, let me tell you, a little rough there. But that's not where they started. Unions started with people organizing in communities around common interests. And our common interest in education is not just our profession. That's huge. That's front and center, our profession, and being the best we can be at being educators. I'm going to tell you this. I think it's our democracy. It's our very democracy that's at stake. And the way that we're going to see this through is by joining together in association and advocating for what's good for kids, what's good for communities, and what's good for our profession. And that's how we're going to elevate our status. And that's what you can do as a new teacher entering this amazing profession.
Well, I would also remind people that in order to have respect, you have to earn respect. And I think that it is our challenge to act as though it's a calling, to put our whole heart and soul into the profession, and then to join together to have a strong voice. For far too long, everyone has told us how to do this profession, whether they are politicians, business people, parents, whoever. And it's not that we don't want to hear what they have to say, but at some point, we have to have the courage to know that we make a difference and that we want to make a difference for students.
I'm really lucky right now. I was a new teacher at my school, and right away, I didn't know what it was about her, but right away I was like, oh, I want to start working with her. And she is a recent Bowdoin Teacher Scholar graduate, and one of the things it's funny, just leading up to this, we were co-planning together, which is a luxury, which we did way outside of school hours and all of those things, but we really enjoyed it. And what she brought to our collaboration was, and I told her this right to her face. I was like, I'm so glad you have shown up this year, because I really needed this. I really needed an opportunity to sit with someone and collaborate. And I asked her a lot about the program that she'd been through, and one of the things that struck me was her practice is very reflective. And I think keeping that reflection as you move into the profession and keeping that willingness and openness to change and collaboration, that it reinvigorates who is already in it, and that's really important to do.
When I graduated from Bowdoin, I actually didn't know what I was going to do. I had been an economics and environmental studies major, literally did nothing in the education field except connect with an education professor here, but never took any courses. And I have always remembered a conversation I had with an uncle of mine when I was actually thinking about going into the environmental field, and did work in the environmental field for a little while. And something that's always driven me is thinking about what is the single most important thing I can do to make a difference in the world. And this uncle of mine, as I was thinking about the environmental field, challenged my thinking, trying to get me to go into the corporate world, saying that perhaps if I made a lot of money and donated it, that would make more of a difference than working in it. And that has stuck with me. And so one of the things that I would say in terms of responsibility with the different groups that you had suggested is that if you're a student out there, and even if you don't go into education, there's a lot that you can still do. We have a student who just graduated from our high school who served as a student rep on our school board, and I encouraged him every step of the way to join whatever school board of the town he ends up living in, because he'll be a great school board member. You could be school board members, you can advocate for all kinds of things. As a parent, you can make a big difference in a school system. And I think that the thing that I would say for everybody in terms of that responsibility that you can take to elevate the status, whether you go into teaching and you yourself becomes somebody who becomes a master teacher that others look to, whether you are a professor here and you take a step beyond just the Bowdoin campus, trying to impact what's happening in the state of Maine, whatever role you take in your community, there are always things that you can do to help elevate the status of teaching. So even if you don't go into the field, you can donate money, give money to Bowdoin for more teacher scholars. There are so many things that you could do, so just think about the myriad ways you could contribute.
I think we should end it right there. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And Thank you to the many teachers who are here tonight. I know it's late for you, so thank you for being here.